Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. So this is the next in the series of depth of field we're talking about. Today we're going to take a look at aperture. I've got an awesome subject for this. It's a beautiful great blue heron. You might have seen him in the last video when we're talking about angles. But this is a great one for aperture. So aperture, when we're dealing with long lenses, is a lot, plays a lot less of a factor compared to shooting with wide angles. But where aperture does come into play, it's whether or not you're going to get the whole bird in focus. So we're going to take a look at these shots and we're going to look at it. Remember the tide's coming in. Okay. So when you're looking at 5.6, and we're going to be, what are we, 1, 2, we're probably about 8 meters, 9 meters here. So with a full frame camera, at 500 millimeters, a 9-meter distance, we are looking at about 10.4 centimeters is your distance that's in focus. So that means 5 centimeters in front, 5 centimeters behind. So if we stop this down to f8, it's going to increase that to 14.69. So that's going to be 7 centimeters in front, 7 centimeters in behind. So let's take a look. We'll have a look at how the different apertures affect the focus, how much of the bird is in focus. We're going to be shooting at 500, so I think we can get most of them in the shot, but let's have a look and we'll see how they compare. Okay, that was awesome. I was able to shoot from 5.6 to f11. I hardly ever shoot at f11 anyway. So that'll give us a good example of, so at f11 on this app, let's just give you an idea what we're looking at. So we're up to 21 centimeters. So we can take a look at how these shots allows us to get like the whole bird in focus and allows you to get all the front feathers in focus. But what you will notice is how, because the background is fairly close on this subject, you will notice how the background starts to become more in focus as we close the aperture down. So that's something to really kind of keep an eye on. And that's something that, for me, I'm not super fussy depending on the subject. As long as the eye is in focus, I'm happy. Then that's generally where I start. With this lens, I find it super sharp at 5.6, so that's where I start. I tend to go head out the door at 5.6, and then as I've got a good subject like this that allows me to open the aperture or stop the aperture down a little bit to get a bit more depth of field, I'll start to play with that. And then I'll also make sure that the ISO is super low. On this, we've got a really nice back. The sun's perfect right behind us right now. So we've got kind of an excellent subject for that. So this is kind of a good example where you can kind of play with it. Okay, so let's jump into Lightroom real quick and we're going to have a look at those photos I just took and we're going to show you what we're comparing when we're looking at the different apertures. Okay, so here's the different shots we've got from 5.6 through to f11. And what you're going to notice when you're looking at the shot, so at 5.6, as I was saying, you can see how the background right behind the bird here is fairly in focus. And what you're going to notice is how this is quite blurred out here. And as we step through the apertures, you're going to notice how much more detail starts to show in those backgrounds. So if you compare the 5.6 to the f11, you can see immediately how much more detail is showing in the f11 shot. You can see, and this is a good example of this day. If you saw the last video, I'll put a little clip up here and show it again. How much atmospheric disturbance was in the air this day. It was a crystal clear October day. You would think it would be perfect conditions. But being that we're right next to the ocean, the cold air blowing off the ocean was hitting the warmer air on the land and just creating amazing amount of atmospheric disturbance. And this will show in some of the photos. And you actually really notice it in the background. And bokeh is one area where you really start to see that atmospheric disturbance, not only in the sharpness of the photograph, but you'll really notice it in the background. So this is kind of a good example where this is 5.6 and this is f11 on this side. This is a one instance where if you had an f4 lens, it would really make a difference on blurring out that background. You're getting an extra stop there, would really help in this situation to help separate that bird away from the background even more than what you're seeing with just the 5.6. When you're looking at aperture and you're looking at bokeh, the higher end prime lenses do a much better job. Even at 5.6, they will be smoother than my 200 to 500 with the bokeh. There's just something about the lens design that will ultimately make for a smoother background even at the same aperture. Let's just kind of go through and we'll kind of have a look at these shots comparatively. So if you're looking at, we've got the 5.6 on the left here and the 7.1 on the right. And when you zoom in, what you'll notice is it's quite subtle, but you can definitely see that there's more detail starting to show through on the 7.1 image. It doesn't quite blur out as smoothly. Just a little more disturbed, we'll say. It's just not as clean. And you actually, funny thing with bokeh, you actually notice it a lot more when you're zoomed out. You'll actually see, so you can see just how it starts to look, I guess it's almost nervous. And again, because of the atmospherics of the day, it makes it even worse. So when you're looking at these, and again, because of the atmospherics, these photos are reasonably sharp. Herons, for whatever reason, Nikon cameras really struggle for getting herons in focus, even with the bird eye autofocus. It has a tendency to want to wander a little bit. So I noticed on some of the shallower aperture, the 5.6 and 6.3, the focus wasn't perfect. So unfortunately, I didn't notice at the time. So the shots, we have to take them a bit of grain of salt for kind of absolute sharpness, but we'll kind of go through and look what we're talking about. So one thing, first off, we look at the feet. So we're looking at, like I said, 5.6 and 7.1, and we zoom in on the feet. You'll notice how this is where you'll start to be able to tell the actual depth of field, and you can see how thin it is. Where you'll notice it goes a little bit further on the back of the log here, from front to back. It's got a little more depth to it. As you go up on the bird, you'll see how there's a little bit of blur here where it's not as sharp, where you notice the 7.1 is definitely a lot sharper. And this is just a little bit more of depth of field. Again, you'll notice how all the feathers through are sharp, whereas a little bit soft in here. And then you get up to the eye is quite sharp on this one and quite sharp on this one. So the eye, you look at a great blue heron, the heron itself is probably 20 centimeters wide from back to front. And I said at 5.6, you're looking at quite a shallow depth of field, and you don't have enough depth of field to get the eye and the front of the wing in focus on the 5.6. Where you notice with the 7.1, there's definitely a lot more feather detail. It's not bad, you know. You can see there it's reasonably sharp here, but you'll notice there is more detail when you're looking at the 7.1. So this is a good example of where stopping down a little bit, that 7.1 is definitely worthwhile to get more of your subject in focus, but it still renders a decent background. You haven't got into that, like I said, that nervous background as you stop it down anymore. So this shot, 7.1, is probably would be almost the perfect aperture, we'll say. Okay, now let's have a look and we'll compare the 7.1 to the f8. So we've got the 7.1 on this side, the f8 on this side. So you notice as we get to f8, you start to see, again, another step of detail in that background. And you start to notice it even more. When you zoom in, you'll see there's more detail on the bushes in the background compared to the 7.1 here. You'll definitely see a little bit more there. They said just all around you start to see more detail. So the bird isn't isolated as much from that background. Now we zoom in on the feet. Again, you'll see how not a ton of in focus there, but with the f8 you start to see a little bit more detail. So you can see that aperture that depth of field is expanded a little bit with the f8. But what's interesting, the depth of field is not as expanded as much as the background is starting to come into focus. So as much as that depth of field is increased, what you're actually seeing more is actually seeing more detail in the background. You're not seeing as clean of a shot. Now let's take a look at the feather detail. And again, you can see that the 7.1, there's definitely a bit more detail through this part of the feathers compared to this section through here. You definitely see a little more detail in this part compared to here. They say, because it's interesting, you notice how it's a little softer here, and this is going to be partially to do with the atmospherics, where there must have been a wave of air coming through to make it so the shot's a little bit uneven. So it's probably not the ideal day to be looking at this, and this is why people like to shoot test charts. But I think sometimes in the field shots, I think sometimes give you a little more information than a test chart might. More real anyway. You see them both nice and sharp on the head of the bird, and lots of feather. Either one of these I think you'd be happy with from a feather detail standpoint. Now we'll look at f9. So we have f8 on the left side, f9 on the right side here. Again, you'll notice a bit more, the balls of the bokeh balls kind of start to come through a little bit more. You definitely will start to see a little more detail, but not too bad. F8 to F9 is not a lot of aperture stop down, so you wouldn't expect to see too much between them. The F9 does start to stand out from a sharpness standpoint. I'm going to have to have a look at this more. This lens, I've got two 200 to 500s, and I think this one has been, it probably needs to go back to Nikon to be recalibrated a little bit. It's been heavily used, but you can definitely see F9, how almost all the feather detail is really standing out and looks really sharp, and it looks quite excellent. So there's definitely something to be said for stopping down a little bit. You see a little more, the whole foot, whole leg looks in focus here. You definitely see more of the feather detail throughout. Looks nice and sharp. You really notice it here compared to a tiny bit softer here, but the F9 really starts to show it. And definitely in the eye, you'll see it as well. Now, I think we'll just do a quick jump to F9 and F11. So when you're zoomed out, you can really see the detail of the F11 showing in the background here. There's a lot more detail showing, and the subject is not isolated nearly as much. It makes a big difference in how the overall image looks. So you can see here, you can see how much more detail starts to show through. And this is why F11, you would never really shoot at F11 unless you had a teleconverter on. It really starts, as much as it might be sharper, you really start to see the noise or the busyness of the background really starts to come into play. Even if you had a distant background, so even if you look at up here in the image, you'll start to see there is still more detail in the background itself. It's just, you can see it's just more detail. It's just a little bit smoother on the F9. This is F9 versus F11. Okay, so now, but where F11 is incredibly sharp, the entire bird shows up in incredible detail. You can see how the entire bird is sharp. All of the feather detail is incredible. Leg as well. You can see how that entire depth of field there. So that's with F11. You can see there's definitely value. So if you're shooting wildlife, larger animals, you can see where F11 can really come into play in that sort of situation, trying to get all of your subject in focus. Like I say, so when you compare the F11 to the 5.6 here, you can just see how much of a difference, how much cleaner the background is on that 5/6 image. And this is just going to really depend on how sharp your lens is. So what this is a good test for this, a good reason to do this sort of test. If you have a good example, you know, you get out in the field, you've got a heron like this, you've got a subject that you can stop down and kind of shoot at all different apertures. What you want to do is you want to have a look and you want to zoom in and figure out at what aperture are you happy with your lens sharpness. So that will be kind of your starting point. And then you, depending on your subject, obviously a heron's quite a large bird, then you can just determine how much you want to stop down in order to get all that feather detail, which you can see here is just incredible. Yeah, like I said, aperture, it's far more important with portraits, landscape type photography, real estate photography, architectural. But when you're dealing with a live subject, kind of the shutter speed, the aperture can impact the shutter speed and the ISO really quickly. So that's where you're going to often make a decision based on, you know, you want to shoot wide open just to make sure you've got the shutter speed you need and you don't want your ISO climbing too high. This is that kind of perfect case where you can definitely stop it down. You got lots of light, you've got a subject that's not moving too fast, so you can really kind of play with it in this regard. So yeah, like I said, aperture, generally with the 150 to 600s, you probably want to shoot at f8 a lot of times. You need to stop them down a little bit to get a little extra sharpness. My 200 to 500, I'm really happy at 5.6, 6.3 might sharpen it up a little bit more. The 180 to 600, I haven't had a chance to play with it. I have heard at 600 you do need to stop it down a little bit, but that's going to depend on your situation. With the primes, obviously they're sharp all the way through, so you can choose your aperture at that point. This heron's a great example too. Often you can chase birds all over, and it's more about picking location. Some birds are just really good. This heron is spectacular. He's a magnificent specimen, but more importantly, he's just not worried about people. People have been walking past right behind him on the trail, and he hasn't moved. He's not worried about it at all. So sometimes where I am up island, a lot of hunting, herons don't like you getting within 200 meters. So this is kind of a really great individual. So when you're given these sorts of opportunities, take advantage of them. Like I say, and these are a great way where come down here, play with the aperture, play with your angles, play with all these different things because you're given such an amazing opportunity. You might as well take advantage of it. Until next time, hope you got some good information out of this. If you did, please like and subscribe. Until next time, we'll see you out there. Take care.